Well, we're now on part 3. There's 4 series that we're studying here in the book of Hosea, and this is part 3. And I realized when I was kind of getting ready for this that there's so much information in this book that sometimes I stand up here and start talking and I don't allow y'all to talk very much. And so, do you have any comments on what we've talked about so far? What has struck you so? What's been most interesting about this book of Hosea as we've studied through the end of chapter 7 so far? Anything? Yes, sir.
The biblical theme from beginning to end: repent or else.
Repent or else. Just because it happened in roughly 725 to 735 before Christ, it's almost like we're reading a narrative of today, right? Anybody else? What is it? Men are slow learners. Mankind, I guess, is probably a better way to say it. Mankind, or men too. Mankind are slow learners. Isn't that the truth? Yes, sir?
Should always be mindful of Romans 15:4. These things are written for our learning.
How come we don't spend more time studying the Bible? We know the Bible tells us that these are written so that we can learn from the mistakes of the past so that we don't repeat them today. Yet we as a people refuse sometimes, that's a generality, not everybody, but sometimes we refuse to study the Bible. And last week we kind of talked about, have you ever thought about your sacrifice of study? Right? The sacrifice of study. Because true Bible study, does it take time? Sure does. Does it take effort? Does it take desire? And do you do it if you don't want to? Right? Isn't that what sacrifice is to God? Doing something for God because we love Him. Right? Any other comments? So just to do a quick review, the first study that we did with Hosea was chapters 1 through chapter 3. And the prophet in the Bible outlines basically the underlying theme of the book, which is God's redeeming love for us. Right? Well, how does God choose to show us that redeeming love? He picks a prophet and he illustrates his wife and the struggles that he has with his wife. And he picks this wife and they have a child and she has some more children. And then the wife leaves him and breaks his heart. And then he can't stand it. And so chapter 3 goes into great detail about how the prophet goes back and buys back his wife for the price of a common slave. And what does he tell her? And we'll paraphrase a little bit. What does he tell her? From this day on, I'm going to forget about the past and you're going to be my wife and I'm going to love you just like I always have. And you've been redeemed. Right? And you say, wow, that is a very interesting way for God to tell a story. But what he's doing is he's laying the groundwork for chapters 4 through 14. Because if we can understand that relationship between the husband and his wife, and his love overcomes everything for that, and then we bring that over and take a look at the nation of Israel and God's love for the nation of Israel, then all of a sudden we kind of see how much the nation hurt God's feelings, don't we? That's the one thing that I've learned in this study. And the book of Hosea points it out so clearly, is that God's feelings were crushed because his people left him. Didn't just leave him. They chose another partner. They left and got married to idol worship. They got married to the spirits of Baal. And it got so bad, and we'll talk about it today, that the nation of Israel did not even understand what God wanted for them anymore. And so God gets upset. And that's what we talked about last week in chapters 4 through the end of 8. 4 through 7. And that's where God has had enough. And He announces the sins of Israel and the punishment that's coming. And He talks extensively about that. And so then it brings us today. What is chapter 8 through the end of chapter 10 going to tell us? Well, basically, it's talking about the warning of the punishment that God is going to bring to Israel. That's what we're going to talk about today. We've got the relationship established. God is hurt. God announced the sins of the people. And now today we'll talk about how He's going to punish the people. Okay? So before we do that, let's go back and read a very interesting verse in chapter 2, verse 13. Because what we're going to talk about today is all predicated on chapter 2, verse 13. And it says, I will punish her for the days of Baals to which she burned incense. She decked herself with her earrings and jewelry and went after her lovers, but me she forgot, says the Lord. But me she forgot. And God has had enough. And so just like us, He's announcing the punishment that must come with that. And so let's move on down here. In this lesson, we shall continue our study of Hosea by noticing God's warning of punishment that is to befall Israel in chapters 8 through 10. Now, I'm going to skip around here and read some verses, and we'll have some commentary, but I want to come back. I want to save some time and come back and hit on 3 main points that I want us to remember from these 3 chapters. Because quite frankly, we could spend 3 or 4 weeks on these 3 chapters. We don't have that kind of time, so I'm going to hit some main topics and then come back and make some main points at the very end. First of all, chapter 8. Let's read 1 through 6 together. This is a warning of approaching judgment on the nation. Set the trumpet to the mouth. He shall come like an eagle against the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law. Israel will cry to me, my God, we know you. Israel has rejected the good. The enemy will pursue him. They set up kings, but not by me. They made princes, but I did not acknowledge them. From their silver and gold they made idols for themselves, that they might be cut off. Your calf is rejected, O Samaria. My anger is aroused against them. How long until they attain innocence? For from Israel is even this, a workman made it, and it is not God, but the calf of Samaria shall be broken into pieces. What is that saying right there? I am going to punish you because you have decided to leave me at the altar and go marry somebody else. Think about it in your personal life. What do you hold dearest to you? Now, you can't say the Bible, and you can't say Jesus, and you can't say God. Family. Your spouse. Your children, your grandchildren, your brothers and sisters. That's the most important thing to us, isn't it? I didn't hear anybody say work. Do you get upset? Do you get hurt when family lets you down? Sure you do, right? Could you imagine how upset God is when He's identified His people in Egypt? He sent Moses and the 10 Commandments and all that. He rescued them. He gave them a land flowing from milk and honey that they didn't deserve, by the way. And He gave them strength and power. And He gave them their law. And not too long, they took that law and threw it in the trash can. And they started making their own gods. And they told the God they didn't care anything about Him. That's what He's saying here. He's saying, and it's because of this, and He names it, I am going to send Assyria to take you back to Egypt. Now, not literally Egypt. Egypt is used here as a sense of the word for captivity, because they understood going back to Egypt, didn't they? So He says, you're going to be taken back to Egypt by Assyria. Now think about that for a second. These people knew the Assyrians. You know why? Because they had approached the Assyrians for trade purposes. They had secured safety from the Assyrians. They had secured help with fortifying some of their cities from the Assyrians. So they knew the Assyrians very well. And they also knew what history tells us about the Assyrians is that they were brutal with their captives. The Assyrian, when the Assyrian people would take people into slavery, oftentimes they would line them up. And remember we read on a few books back, there was a mention about fish hooks with the Assyrians. That's real. The Assyrians would take fish hooks and sometimes put the fish hooks through the bridge of the nose on their captives, and they would line the fish hooks up with rope. And that's how they would lead their slaves around and make sure that they didn't leave. And if anybody tried to escape, they were brutally murdered. That's the Assyrians that they're telling them is fixing to come and take you hostage. So you would think that they would wake up to that. But what we read about in Amos is still true because it's 30 years later, and we're reading about it here, when they had secured their relationship with the Assyrians because they made money off of it. They didn't think the Assyrians would actually come get them. They put their faith in man instead of their faith in God. We do that all the time, don't we? Let's keep reading here. Look at verse 11 in chapter 8. Because Ephraim has made many altars for sin, they have become for him altars for sinning. Verse 13. For the sacrifices of my offerings, they sacrifice flesh and eat it, but the Lord does not accept them. Now He will remember their iniquity and punish their sins. They shall return to Egypt. It's more the same. Through their alliance with Assyria, they're now going to reap the whirlwind. See, Israel has forgotten his Maker, and even Judah is mentioned here very quickly in verse 14. For Israel has forgotten his Maker and has built temples. Judah also has multiplied fortified cities, but I will send fire upon his cities, and it shall devour his palaces. See, Judah is not exempt from this. This is just mainly being taught to the nation, to the northern kingdom of Israel. Judah is going to get theirs too, but it's going to be in a different way. We know history tells us that Judah doesn't go into Assyrian captivity, they go into Babylonian captivity. And for the Bible students, what happens, we're jumping forward a little bit, what happens when the nation of Israel goes into Assyrian captivity? They're gone. They're a nation no more. They assimilate into the people, and their identity is forever gone. Why did God make that happen? Because they left Him. They left Him at the altar. In chapter 9, we change a little bit. It talks specifically about the Assyrian captivity. I'll read verses 3, 7, and 9. They shall not dwell in the Lord's land, but Ephraim shall return to Egypt, and shall eat unclean things in Assyria. Verse 7. The days of punishment have come, the days of recompense have come. Israel knows. The prophet is a fool, the spiritual man is insane, because of the greatness of your iniquity and great enmity. Verse 9. They are deeply corrupted as in the days of Gilba. He will remember their iniquity. He will punish their sins. You see, do you feel the tension in the writings of the prophet here? See, let's remember, Hosea is a prophet from the northern kingdom in Israel, speaking to Israel. Unlike Amos was from the southern kingdom of Judah, prophesying to the northern kingdom. He didn't like those people very much, and he was just giving it to them like it is. Hosea, these are his people. And you can feel the pleadings throughout these 14 chapters. And you see his anger come up, and then his sorrow come up, and it's almost like a roller coaster of emotion. And that's what you're reading here. He's pleading, saying, don't you understand these Assyrians who you put all of your trust in? Don't you understand what they're going to do to you? Once again, Egypt is used as a type for captivity, but the Assyrian is mentioned by name. No longer will they be able to celebrate their feasts. What does that mean? No longer will they be able to celebrate their feasts. Are slaves able to come and go and do what they want to do when they want to do it? They're going to be in captivity. Look at verse 10. Actually, we'll go, verse 10. I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. Verse 11. As for Ephraim, their glory shall fly away like a bird. No birth, no pregnancy, no conception. That's kind of interesting. I found you in Egypt. I delivered you out of the slavery and the bondage. I gave you my name. I gave you my laws. And now because of your actions, I'm putting you right back where you came from. Now, chapter 10, verses 1 through 15, we won't spend time there because it's more of the same. You kind of get the drift, right? God has had it. He's upset, and He's announced the Assyrians as going to be their captors. Did the people listen? No. Why didn't the people listen? Why didn't they listen to Amos? 30 years later, why didn't they listen to Hosea? The Bible tells us all throughout the reason why they didn't listen is because they were too concerned with themselves. Pride was number one. They wanted to do what they wanted to do, when they wanted to do it, and how they wanted to do it. And it all goes back from, in my opinion, it goes back to an error that was made when they crossed the Jordan River to take over the Promised Land. What did God specifically tell them to do when He delivered out of the wanderings? He gave them the Promised Land. He took them over the Jordan River. The first city was Jericho, and then they were going to go north. What was their instructions to do to take over that land? Wipe it out. Utterly destroy the people that are there. Why? Because God knows people. And if you leave any of that sin around, eventually they will come in and corrupt you. And when they didn't utterly destroy the people, then the people utterly destroyed them. And how does it happen? This is why the Bible is so interesting to me. How does it happen? It starts with marriage. What happened to the nation of Israel? They started marrying people of that land, right? And the people of that land had their own gods, and they had their own worship, and they had their own form of religion. And just like spouses that try to make things good at home, all of a sudden those religions folded into the nation of Israel over time to where it got to the point that they didn't even know God. So do you see how sometimes a problem over here rears itself in a big problem over here? So when the Bible warns us on these things, they're written for our learning so that we don't make the same mistake. That's what we're learning here in Hosea. Now, I'm kind of tired of talking about that. And I'm ready for next week's lesson because guess what? Next week's lesson, the prophet says there's redemption coming. Now, we'll talk about that next week. But I want to go backwards a little bit and make 3 points from this study of today. Look at Hosea chapter 8, verse 12. I purposely skipped this verse when we read it just a minute ago. To tell you how far these people had left God, verse 12 says, I have written for him the great things of my law, but they were considered a strange thing. What does that mean? I have given them the great things of my law, but they consider those strange. Does that show us, does that one verse show us how far into sin that this nation had become? Now, how does that happen? I have a question here. How do we know what the Bible says if we don't study it? If we don't study the Bible, over time, can those things become strange to us? You think about it. Go up into parts of this country that's not considered into the Bible Belt and start talking about what we're talking about today in somewhere, say, up into the Northeast, where it seems most of the citizenry up there is agnostic at best. Would they think this is strange? Would they even believe it? Do you see how 730 to 40 BC and 2018 are not that far apart from each other? It's scary. And the feeling that you get reading these chapters and the emotional roller coaster that's going on, you should feel in this room too, because we're living the exact same thing. Now, thank goodness for you people in this church, because quite frankly, if you're here on a Sunday morning before the formal worship service, you're not in this group. All right? I like that. That's good. But look how many people aren't here. Right? What about your personal sacrifice of study to God to make sure that you don't get here. What does sacrifice take? It takes time. It takes effort. It takes want to. And it takes a drive. I would like to challenge you next week when we come back. Whoever's sitting beside you, study something this week and tell them what you learned when you get here next week. Anything. Take the Bible and open it up and take a paragraph and study whatever that paragraph is and tell your neighbor what you learned that week. It's just something. It gets us in the mode of studying the Bible. Number 2. Look at Hosea chapter 10, verse 12. Sow for yourselves righteousness and reap in mercy. Break up your fallow ground, for it is time to seek the Lord till He comes and rains righteousness on you. Now, don't read this like you're 725. Let's read this like we're 2018. This is us. He's talking to us. Let's read it right here. Sow for yourselves righteousness and reap in mercy. For it is time to seek the Lord till He comes and rains righteousness on you. Now, I got to thinking about that. Is there a New Testament example that can relate to this verse? And I thought about Cornelius. You remember that guy? Turn over to Acts chapter 10. Now, who was Cornelius? And why am I talking about him? Okay? Because listen to what he does and how he does it, and then see how God rewards that behavior. All right? Let's read it together, verses 1 through 6. There was a certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius, a centurion of what was called the Italian regiment. Verse 2, he was a devout man and one who feared God with all of his household, who gave alms generously to all the people and prayed to God always. About the 9th hour of the day, he saw clearly in a vision an angel of God coming and saying to him, Cornelius. And when he observed him, he was afraid and said, What is it, Lord? So he said to him, Your prayers and your alms have come up for a memorial before God. Now send men to Joppa and send for Simon, whose surname is Peter. He is lodging with Simon, a tanner whose house is by the sea, and he will tell you what you must do. And then we go to about verse 48, and he tells him what to do. And he says, and after he goes and gets Peter, he comes back, and Peter says, and he commanded them to be baptized in the name of the Lord. Okay? Now, what does that have to do with back here when it says, sow for yourselves righteousness and reap in mercy? We'll all agree that you can't work your way to heaven, can we? Works don't equal salvation. But this man's works got him what? Got him mercy. And God recognized that and sent Peter to him for the first time in history so that the gospel could be shared on purpose to the Gentiles. Think about that. He feared God. He gave to the poor. He prayed every day. And God rewarded that with mercy. So although we'll all agree that you cannot work your way to heaven, but you can sure work yourself into mercy with God. After all, what do we really need? Mercy. Yes, sir.
You can't get there without working, no. In a sense, is applying to saying that, why do you do this? You can't do it, but you love God, therefore, you are going to do what you can to be pleasing to Him.
Yes, right.
And what will bring glory and honor to Him. And that means you've got to do something.
That's right. Yeah, you can't just sit like a bump on a log, right? Because that's not God's plan. God's plan is to use people to teach other people the righteousness of God. And in so doing, people are saved. I thought that was just amazing when I read that. Sow for yourselves righteousness and reap in mercy. Care for people. Help people out. Don't forget, 30 years before this, Amos was chastising the people. Why? The number one thing was social injustice. They were trading people for shoes. That's how lowly they thought of people. And now they're saying, show righteousness. Show mercy to people. Because we're in the people business. Right? The last thing, we're right on time. Look at Hosea chapter 10, verse 13. So we read the chapter, the verse before, now verse 13. Right on the heels of that. You have plowed wickedness. You have reaped iniquity. You have eaten the fruit of lies because you trusted in your own way, in the multitude of your mighty men. Kind of a mouthful there. Does anybody's version, instead of saying you have reaped iniquity, does it say anything else there? Evil. Injustice. You kind of get what they're saying here. You have plowed wickedness and reaped whatever word your Bible says right there. Why does it say that? Because wickedness always produces injustice or iniquity or evil. Right? They go hand in hand. When you are all about wickedness, then a byproduct of that is you're really all about sin. And that's what Hosea is screaming at the top of his lungs. And he's saying, y'all don't even get it anymore because you don't even know who God is. But you've gone so far into the wickedness, you don't even know the sin that you're living in. And that's why I'm writing this book to you. And unfortunately, it's too late. So, the conclusion. The messages of Hosea, though first spoken to the people of an earlier time, speak to us also. History tends to repeat itself. Can we learn from the mistakes of others? Have to. Shame on us if we don't. And then look at number 3 on the last page. Will His words be well known to us, or will they too be considered a strange thing? Are we going to learn from this, or is this just a nice story that we talk about in the church building? Right? We're making our way through these minor prophets. Thank goodness we get to talk about a little redemption next week. Because I have to tell you, this has been a very, almost disturbing book to read. Between Amos and this, I feel like I'm picking up a 2018 encyclopedia. and it's scary. Hold on one second. One comment and then yours. Yes, sir.
One common mistake made often of those who study and read the Bible is to realize the time that's involved. Sometimes there'll be many years between two verses. In Hosea's case, from the time his wife became unfaithful until he took her back again, may have been a 20 or 30-year period.
That's right. Yes, sir.
When you started, pointing out the relationship of a husband and wife and how Israel's relationship to God is like that. And yet Ephesians tells us that the church relationship is the same to God as a husband and wife relationship. And husbands and wives should do things for one another because they love one another. That's the way the church should do things for God.
Yeah.
Not because we think we can get there by doing it, but because we know He's made the ultimate sacrifice. We know that there's reconciliation that can only come through Christ. And that has to come because we want to do it because we love Him. You can't make me do it. Nobody else can. It has to be developed from that love.
That's such a good point. And so, in closing, to put a fine point on that, the 3rd chapter of Hosea is only 5 verses long. When we break, read that. And it illustrates exactly what was just said. It gives you a vivid story about a husband and his wife and the heartbreak that happens and the warm redemption of forgiveness that occurs. But don't read that as to Hosea and Gomer. Homer. Read it as God and us.
Thanks, brother. That's good. But there's an old kind of a joke or story that used to go around about one day in court they couldn't find the Bible, and so the bailiff said to the judge, "You'll get old brother Jones over here from the Church of Christ. He's a walking Bible." Now, can that be said about us today?
That's it.
And if we don't study, it's gone.
That's right. Study something this week and tell your neighbor what you learned. Thank y'all for coming. Next week, a little bit more uplifting.